with notions of political culture, strategic culture, national styles, and the like. The common idea of these concepts is that culture somehow exerts influence over the politics. Thus, the politics is seen as something separate from culture, an object, rather thing, which comes in a variety of cultural versions. Culturalism holds tradition as the encompassing sphere and ends up by positing cultural relativism. In Mickūnas' perspective, intentionality precedes culture, and such approach allows to avoid relativism by considering particular ideas not as different interpretations of the same concept, but as separate though equally possible nods of the meaning within the vertical dimension of intentionality. Brought to the domain of international relations, such an approach most probably would point to the limits or even futility of moralizing foreign policies. Mickūnas as well elaborates a different notion of politics. A politics is what a political community does. Politics is not a thing, but a process, a phenomenon, and therefore does not have an independent objective existence without a political community, but only can be maintained by it. Thus, the existence of political community is the prerogative for politics to appear. The notion applied to the international relations domain could provoke a question whether the field of international relations could be characterized as political. It is, whether the term world or international politics still makes sense. My answer would be sometimes yes and sometimes no. Most probably, the majority of debates going on within various international organizations like United Nations or NATO and international political systems like the European Union could be defined as politics in Mickūnas' meaning. Actions emanating from such debates or sanctioned with them are also treated as political. However, the cases of Soviet invasions to Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia 68, or Afghanistan 78, or United States invasions to Vietnam or Iraq are simply unilateral exertions of power with no communal decisions preceding it, and therefore cannot be treated as political events. Several observations could be noted at this point. First, I see Mickūnas' notion of politics as level-dependent concept. What is a politics at the lower level of relations not necessarily is politics on the higher level. US invasion of Iraq was debated within US and sanctioned by the Congress. Thus, it is the political decision at the level of the national policy of USA. However, it has no feature of being political at the international level as far as it was not sanctioned by the United Nations. Secondly, Mickūnas separates politics from power in a way that they become mutually exclusive concepts. In such a setting, power cannot be viewed as a feature of politics. Actions can either be political or power-driven. Therefore, the concept of power politics is not compatible with Mickūnas' perspective. Another important point pertaining to the studies of international relations is the relation between politics and culture, as reflected from Mickūnas' understanding of the life world. International politics or other practices of international relations as the extensions of domestic politics are bound to the particular life worlds, which can be comprehended by the transcendental interreflection. This approach may be worth applying in foreign policy analysis, where currently dominate methods of interpretation employing meanings of the particular life world. As an example, I would like to quote the article providing analysis of the relations between the West and Uzbekistan. The issue discussed in that article is the agreement on military transit, which was vitally important for the supplies of the United States and NATO troops in Afghanistan. So, notwithstanding to his own assessment that the agreement was functioning properly, author concluded that the state of relations between US and Uzbekistan was unsatisfactory, for military cooperation did not positively influence the human rights situation in Uzbekistan. Although there is a conspicuous analytical flaw in the quote, the mismatch between goals set and the results measured, the flaw actually is rooted in what Mickūnas calls intentionality of consciousness. Now, for to be applied in international relations studies, the concept of life wealth, on the one hand, need to be classifiable. On the other hand, it should be clear how to integrate the concept into ongoing discourse of international relations studies. Mickūnas claims that the intentionality of consciousness is characterized by the relationship between two aspects, the flux and the permanence. Thus, life wealth differ depending on how do they perceive flux and the permanence relationship. The way to ground the concept of the life wealth within the context of current international relations is to relate it to the category of civilization. The particular kind of interplay between permanence and flux forms architectonics of civilizational consciousness. The different architectonics of consciousness would provide for construction for different meanings, which in turn would translate in certain, and what is particularly important for international relations, rather predictable modes of behavior on international scene. For example, from Mickūnas' permanence flux perspective, it was rather predictable that the EU sanctions and stance on anti-Azan events in 2005 in Uzbekistan and the introduction of sanctions will end up in failure for the West. Firstly, Western diplomacy failed to grasp that the Islam civilization is characterized by the relationship between authority and society, which is very different from that in the West. Islamic civilizational consciousness treats permanence as the feature of divine, thus absolutely positive. Meanwhile, the flux is mainly perceived negatively. In majority of Islamic societies, the flux is not merely change, it is a contradiction of permanence, it is disagreement with divine, it is absolute evil. Moreover, such a perception of the flux-permanence relationship dictates very specific mode of action. The contradiction against divine cannot be simply stated or observed, it should be actively punished. There can be no dialogue between permanence and flux, for the very idea of considering arguments of flux as bearing certain sense is evil itself. Thus, while the West considered the mass street riots in Andijan as the situation requiring, first of all, peaceful clarification of motives by the means of dialogue, Uzbek leadership it assessed as immediately punishable with no regard to the adequacy of the means employed to that end. Secondly, if flux-permanence relationship issue would be taken into account, it would immediately become clear that the Western perception of governance as a societal function of adjusting interests of different groups of society for the common good is absolutely inapplicable to any of societies of Islam civilization. There, the authority and power is sanctioned by divine, thus flawless in principle. The actions of governor cannot be questioned. He instructs society on any aspect of life. The very idea of discussion between the governor and the society is close to absurd. Therefore, requirements by the West made on behalf of the international community to start immediate consultations between sides involved were a priori refutable for Uzbek leadership. Thirdly, taking into account the basics of civilizational thinking would probably save the West from the most inappropriate way of speaking to the Asian head of state. Public imperative statements issued on behalf of the international community. As the personification of permanence, Asian leader cannot succumb to the outside power arguments, for it will inevitably deteriorate his authority at home. The actions pursued by the West left Uzbek president practically with no other choice than confronting the West head-on, and finally he took the whole situation not as a diplomatic challenge, which normally happens from time to time, but as a personal insult, and the latter fact demanded a lot of efforts to resolve it on the side of the Western diplomacy when it appeared later that apart from Uzbekistan, there is no other viable alternatives to organize military supplies for the troops in Afghanistan. Explanatory and prognostic powers of phenomenological approach could be enhanced through connections with anthropology of civilizations, making use of its methods of classification and comparison of meanings. I have found for this purpose that Vytautas theory of civilizational structures can be used to fine-tune flux permanence approach to practically every situation on international arena. Kavolis posits 4 civilizational structures, or modes of thinking, or intentionality towards set meaning. The perception of relationship between structure and energy, attitudes, thoughts, order, and chaos, modes of rebellion, and the relationship between secular and sacral spheres. The mentioned story of Andijan events can be explained as the manifestation of encounter between 2 different modes of rebellion. It could also be forecast that such an encounter would replicate itself in the future, should the West always choose to act on its moral imperative. Additionally, applying other civilizational structures, I would forecast that if the replication of the encounter would be stopped, the agent of change would be the West, by choosing alternative action scenarios, but not the society of Islam civilization, stopping seeing rebellion as immediately punishable. And so my conclusions are that application of the concepts of the phenomenology of culture to the studies of international relations may compensate some of the shortcomings of rationalist methods, namely the objectification of the world and the individuation of the subject. In contrast to the culturalist thinking, Mickūnas posits the precedence of intentionality over culture or tradition. This allows him to consider norms as a completely separate meanings constructed by the different life worlds, whereas culturalist thinking ends up by positing cultural relativism. Adoption of Mickūnas' way of thinking allows to look at the international relations as the process of exchange of meanings. Therefore, comprehension of these meanings should be deemed important, both for analysis of international relations and foreign policy planning. And phenomenology is the appropriate framework for that. And the last thing is that Mickūnas' perspective actually adds a highly important feature for the both studies and practice of international relations, and this feature is predictability. Thank you for your attention.
All right, questions?
This question for Russell.
Yes.
You are familiar with